Hello and welcome to EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, your weekly dose of the top pro-life news and issues, all from a Catholic perspective. I'm Szeltner in our Washington, D.C. studio. I hope you're all having a great Thanksgiving week with your loved ones. Here's what you can expect in this show. The Vatican talks euthanasia and end-of-life issues. We speak out against a disturbing report involving so-called religious leaders at a Texas abortion clinic, and this.
St. Francis called death her friend, but we view death as a passage to life.
During this month of Holy Souls, we hear how death should impact our life. But first, our top story, Planned Parenthood on trial. Abortion providers took the stand in Texas earlier this month in a closely watched case that centers around the state's dismemberment abortion ban. Texas passed the dismemberment abortion ban earlier this year. It outlaws the abortion procedure that involves tearing a fully formed child apart limb by limb before removing the child from the mother's womb. It's often called dilation and evacuation, or a D&E abortion. After the measure was signed into law, the Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood filed a lawsuit to challenge it, and Judge Lee Yeakel heard arguments in early November. In the trial, abortion providers disclosed how they performed these abortions, and their testimony was on the record. Ken Paxton is the Texas Attorney General and the defendant in the case Whole Woman's Health versus Paxton. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
First off, this case is all about the abortion industry going after Texas's dismemberment abortion ban. Tell us what that law prevents exactly.
So the legislature this past session, back in May, I believe, passed a bill basically banning dismemberment of babies. Obviously, this is a horrible subject to have to talk about. All the legislature was saying is, you know, we treat animals a certain way, we treat criminals a certain way. We ought to at least have the decency to treat a baby that's going to be aborted in a certain way, which is to make sure that they don't have to suffer this horrible procedure.
The trial wrapped up earlier this month. We don't have a ruling yet, but why was this case so important? Well,
it's important because the Texas legislature and the people of Texas have a right to protect the unborn and to make sure that they're treated humanely with dignity. And obviously, you know, they're killing these babies, but if you're going to do that, if it's going to be allowed up to 20 weeks, then we want it done in the most humane way that can be done. And right now, you know, this dismemberment of babies, you know, the trial showed it's just an incredibly gruesome, horrific process.
Absolutely. This case has factual record. So that means everything that was said on trial, there's record of it. Why is this so important, and how can the pro-life movement use this?
So we'd always, in the past, the cases had been more about procedure, and no one had actually gotten Planned Parenthood in these groups in a trial where they actually had to disclose and defend what they were doing. And so, you know, a 5-day trial, you can ask a lot of questions of their doctors about what they're doing, and then our experts providing more information about what they're doing. We made them describe, you know, bit by bit, word by word, exactly the horrible process of dismembering these babies and just how brutal it is.
So then we can use that as a reference and refer back to that as proof.
Exactly. So we wanted that, so depending on how it goes at the trial court, we can at least take that record up, and it's evidence for future cases.
Abortion advocates repeat the line, dismemberment abortions are safe and common, safe and common. How do you respond to that?
I say, when you sit in trial and you listen to what happens to these babies, these unborn babies, it's not so safe for them. It's not so, I mean, it's got to be a very traumatic experience for these babies when their body parts are just being ripped apart.
So once again, this ban wouldn't ban all abortions. It's just specifically this one procedure, and the abortion industry took you to court over it.
That's exactly right. They wanted no regulations. They don't want any restrictions on how they do it, despite the fact that, you know, it's just this awful procedure, and frankly, they know it because they hide it with, you know, other words that try to hide exactly what they're doing.
Why do you think they are so adamant about being able to continue on with this specific dismemberment abortion?
I think it's easy for them. You know, it's just an easier process for them, and they just don't like the idea of any restrictions at all. And so, you know, they've been given favorable treatment by the courts in the past, and I think they thought, why shouldn't we try to get favorable treatment again?
We're speaking about how this would prevent this inhumane procedure, but we believe that all of abortion is inhumane. So why is this ban a good step for the pro-life movement?
So obviously, I'm pro-life either way. I don't like any abortions occurring, but given the fact that abortions are legal up to 20 weeks in Texas, we banned them after 20 weeks, which that ban is stuck. We did that a few years ago. Given the fact that you can legally get an abortion up to 20 weeks, which no matter how it's done, obviously, I would view it as killing a baby. Since we can't restrict it from happening, we want to at least make it the most humane process we can. And instead of destroying the baby bit by bit, there are other more humane ways to do an abortion prior to 20 weeks.
How significant, from your perspective, how significant is this case, and could a precedent be set here?
Well, I think it's a precedent for the whole country, because there have been other cases that have been decided on procedural grounds in other states where they've lost. There's a few other states where there has been no challenge. Ours would actually be the first case where we'd actually gotten the evidence into a trial about what is actually happening, and let the world see, and let's make a decision about this based on the facts and based on what this industry is actually doing.
Ken Paxton, Texas Attorney General, thank you for being here.
Glad to do it. Thank you.
In more pro-life news, President Donald Trump adds 5 more judges to his list of potential nominees to the Supreme Court. The list includes federal appellate judge Brett Kavanaugh, who dissented when his colleagues recently allowed an immigrant teenager to get an abortion. Another name is federal appellate judge Amy Coney Barrett, who faced criticism for her Catholic faith during her Capitol Hill confirmation hearing. President Trump says he will choose from this expanded list of judges to fill future Supreme Court vacancies. Joining us now is Marjorie Dannenfelser, president of the Susan B. Anthony List. Marjorie, good to have you this Thanksgiving week.
Great to be here. I'm very grateful.
So looking at this list of nominees, what's your impression of this list?
Oh, it's a fantastic list. The first list was great. This addendum is ideal. You've got Amy Barrett, who was subjected to this horrendous, just a horrible communication from Dianne Feinstein that somehow her faith would disqualify her as a judge. Well, the last laughs on the senator. She is a judge now.
Dogma is living loudly.
Dogma living loudly. I want that button on me. And then there's Brian Kavanaugh, who was who had a very strong dissent in the case of Jane Doe, the young woman, undocumented immigrant who ended up getting an abortion. But he strongly disagreed and communicated it beautifully. Those two are on that list. This president's doing what he said he was going to do.
There are no Supreme Court vacancies, though, at this time. So is this list even relevant? Should we be paying attention to it?
Oh, yeah. It is the investment in our future. And it is really based on the very real the reality that it looks that we will lose at least a couple of judges during this president's term. There is a very strong rumor that Kennedy could be gone in the fall, which is quite soon. These rumors come up all the time. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not, but they're based on the reality that we have an aging Supreme Court, and we could have 2, even 3 justices to replace. So this list means everything. It should be a focus of great attention and great gratitude right now.
That we're prepared for that.
Yes.
Speaking with Ken Paxton earlier in the show, it's a reminder that judges make a difference, not just at the Supreme Court level, but at all different levels. With that Texas dismemberment abortion ban, would you agree with that? And how has President Trump been doing with nominations at all levels? Yeah,
I mean, he's been doing fantastically with the nominations. They're very slow in getting through the Senate, and this is a problem. But you're right about the importance. It was a campaign promise that really swayed the election in a lot of ways for the first time ever. He's following through on nominations, and clearly Gorsuch was a beginning. But when you look at the dismemberment ban that the Attorney General was discussing, it matters profoundly. It is the whole ball game. What judge actually looks at that when it will inevitably be challenged? That judge will have the ability to set it aside, or and perhaps it'll be challenged again. But then it'll go to an appeals court. Will be another bank of judges who look at it. It's really the whole ball of wax.
Speaking of justice, staying on this theme, the FBI is signaling a possible investigation into Planned Parenthood and whether they illegally sold fetal tissue from aborted babies. Planned Parenthood has come back and said the 3 congressional committees, 12 states, and a Texas grand jury has found no criminal wrongdoing. Is that correct?
It is amazing to me the ease with which they lie. That is simply not true at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, 3 congressional committees and then a Senate committee looked through 30,000 pages of evidence and then produced a 470-page report of evidence that they might have been doing this. It is so clear and present and threatening to Planned Parenthood that they are clearly lying in the face of it. So on the state level, 12 states, they claim 12 states have looked at this and set aside those charges. Absolutely not true. Because what was an investigation on the House and Senate level was not an investigation on the state level. This just passed through these offices and they did cursory reviews and decided not to look at it. So we have to look very closely at their claims.
Marjorie, it's been over 2 years since those undercover Planned Parenthood videos were first released. What would you like to see from the federal government in investigating Planned Parenthood and whether or not they illegally profited from the sale of aborted baby body parts?
Well, 2 things must happen. One, I believe, and that is the investigation of what's going on. And just recently, the Attorney General Sessions requested information from Senator Grassley's committee about their findings. That is moving forward. I'm going to have a meeting with him in a few weeks. We won't even be able to talk about that because, thank God, we believe it's an ongoing investigation. But on the other hand, also the Senate and the Congress and this President have the ability to allow states to cut off funding for Planned Parenthood through Medicaid. That can be done very soon.
Okay.
And that is something that we're really calling on to happen very soon. In fact, the President can do that without the Congress. The Congress, however, in their leadership role that they have, I believe should be calling on the President to do that. I think he can do that. We just need a little bit more movement in the Medicaid system here.
Let's see if that movement happens. Marjorie
Yes.
Dannenfelser, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Being pro-life and having pro-life beliefs will mean nothing if we cannot exercise those beliefs. Current U.S. federal law does not sufficiently protect the conscience rights of healthcare professionals and others. There have been instances where health professionals, against their religious beliefs, were forced to participate in abortions. That is why the Conscience Protection Act is the top pro-life priority for the U.S. Bishops and the focus for pro-life leaders. We're going to tell you how you can help get the Conscience Protection Act passed through Congress and signed into law. Here is what you can do. Go to your computer or smartphone right now. Type in this website, prolifeweekly.com. That is prolifeweekly.com. It's on the screen right now. At this website, you will see 3 boxes. 1 to type in your first name, a second to type in your last name, and finally a 3rd box to type in your email address. Once you fill out all that information, you will click Add My Name. This sends a message to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to include the Conscience Protection Act and the upcoming appropriations bill. If it passes, it would bar the federal government and any state and local governments that receive federal funding from taking action against healthcare professionals who conscientiously object to performing, paying, or participating in any procedure they find morally objectionable. President Trump has said he will sign this into law if it passes Congress. Do your part to promote this pro-life bill. Go to prolifeweekly.com. That's prolifeweekly.com. Type in your information and click Add My Name. We need to tell Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to include the Conscience Protection Act and the upcoming appropriations bill. Turning now to more pro-life news, we go to EWTN's Valeria Longhi for the international headlines.
A child leading prayer at the Catholic Mass celebrated this past week in the Dominican Republic for the 2017 Caminata Un Paso por Mi Familia, a pro-family march. The auxiliary bishop of Santo Domingo, Bishop Faustino Burgos Brisman, said, "If the family crumbles, then society, the nation, and the world will crumble as well." He said the march is a call to take another look at family and see where we are taking it. Pope Francis sent a message to health workers and organizations last week saying compassion is the heart of what they do. The Holy Father also stressed the need for a more equitable distribution of resources and services throughout the world. This includes, Pope Francis says, doctors, nurses, support staff, volunteers, and others to minimize the pain associated with loneliness and anxiety. Our Holy Father reminds us compassion helps us to discover in the frailness of every human being his or her unique worth and dignity. The Australian State Parliament marathon debate on euthanasia came to an abrupt end last Friday after a lawmaker collapsed in his office. Government lawmaker Daniel Molino is reportedly fine now, but his collapse kept the euthanasia issue unresolved. Victoria, Australia is the final stage of a parliamentary debate that could legalize doctor-assisted suicide. Half of the 30 lawmakers in the upper chamber indicated support for reform. Molino himself is against euthanasia. If passed, a doctor in Victoria, Australia would be permitted to administer a lethal injection when patients were physically incapable of doing so themselves. Valeria Longhi, EWTN, Pro-Life Weekly.
Thank you, Valeria, for those pro-life headlines from around the globe. Pope Francis says when it comes to end-of-life care, treatments should always be based with human dignity in mind. His message came during last week's World Medical Association meeting on end-of-life questions. The meeting was held in the Vatican and in collaboration with the Pontifical Academy for Life. The conference addressed complex issues surrounding end-of-life care and the moral and ethical questions they raised. Dr. John Keown is a professor of Christian ethics at Georgetown University. He is also a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life and joins us now from Rome. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Keown, give us the highlights from this conference on euthanasia that took place in the Vatican.
Well, there were a number, actually. There was a very interesting panel discussion featuring the head of the German Medical Association, the Swiss Medical Association, and the Dutch Medical Association. Those countries have different laws in relation to euthanasia and assisted suicide. There was also a very fascinating closing panel discussion in which people at the conference were allowed to ask questions of the panel or make their own comments. So there was a very frank and fruitful exchange of views.
How much of a priority is this specific topic, euthanasia, for the Pontifical Academy for Life?
I think the whole question of end-of-life care is a priority for the Academy, and the Academy, although it's very clear that it maintains the Church's fundamental opposition to euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, nevertheless is very concerned to promote palliative care, because palliative care is basically absent from many countries in the world, which is an international scandal. And even in developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, there are serious deficiencies in the provision of good palliative care to many people. So it's an inequity, and in many ways it's a scandal that so many people are allowed to die in pain and suffering.
We've been closely following the case involving Belgium's Brothers of Charity, with Catholic hospitals offering euthanasia, though the hospitals may soon be stripped of their Catholic identity. How pervasive is this threat of euthanasia even to our Catholic institutions?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, clearly there is the argument that Catholic institutions should have nothing to do with euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, because it's clearly fundamentally incompatible with the teachings of the Church. So it's very difficult to see how a Catholic institution could possibly be involved in euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, but as we know, some of them are, so it's a great concern.
I know Pope Francis addressed the conference. What was his message?
Pope Francis sent a message that was read out by Cardinal Turkson, and I think he made the following important points. One is that modern medical technology is so advanced that it is now possible to maintain life, and even when that is not promoting the overall good of the patient. So where treatment is disproportionate, then the Church is clear that there is no obligation to maintain those treatments. So treatments can be either futile or excessively burdensome, and it's always been the Church's view that those treatments may be withdrawn. Whereas at the same time, one must be careful never to intend the patient's death, because that would be euthanasia, whether by act or omission. And also, even when one has withdrawn treatments or there are no treatments available, it's crucially important to maintain one's care and love for the ill. The Holy Father mentioned that when we're confronted with suffering, there is often a temptation to abandon patients, and we should never do that. He cited the parable of the Good Samaritan. We should always care, though we should never kill. And finally, a point he made, in which really explains, I think, the Pontifical Academy's involvement in this WMA conference, was that we should try and promote shared solutions through a process of open dialogue, recognizing the diversity of views in the world, the diversity of religious beliefs, while nevertheless being very firm that the law should always maintain and protect the fundamental equality of every human being, especially the weakest.
Dr. John Keown with Pontifical Academy for Life, thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back,
Death is something we should have a good relationship with without being morbid.
how death should impact our lives. Stay tuned as EWTN Pro-Life Weekly continues after this break. Welcome back to EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. I'm Catherine Szeltner. This next story is an example of so-called religious leaders leading their flock astray and twisting God's words to feed an agenda of death and destruction. Based on a Facebook post by Whole Woman's Health and an article in the Texas Observer, earlier this month, a group of so-called clergy, not Catholic, gathered at an abortion clinic in Fort Worth, Texas to, quote, bless abortion providers, clinic staff, and patients. The group reportedly sang hallelujah and prayed. When we sing hallelujah, we should be praising God, not praising abortion, which goes directly against God, the author of life. If we're going to debate abortion on biblical grounds, it's clear where the good book stands. Thou shalt not kill. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And many more verses. It's not up for debate. What these so-called religious leaders are doing is dishonest and deceitful. But using ministers and twisting truth to persuade the faithful to support abortion is nothing new for the industry. In a 1939 letter, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger wrote, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." Let us pray for those in the abortion industry that they may find truth, mercy, and be transformed in Christ to promote life. Meanwhile, this past weekend, I attended a very different kind of clinic blessing. Arlington's Bishop Michael Burbidge blessed the Mother of Mercy Free Medical Clinic on the first World Day of the Poor. Previously an abortion clinic, the center has since been bought out and transformed to become a free medical clinic in Virginia run by Catholic Charities. This comes after years and years of prayer from the local faithful, and I look forward to bringing you that clinic blessing story in the coming weeks. Remember, there's always something you can do to counter today's culture of death. You can pray and you can follow our call to action. Go to prolifeweekly.com. Tell Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to include the Conscience Protection Act and the upcoming appropriations bill. During this month of Holy Souls, we are called to reflect and pray for the dead. In a homily just a few days ago, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, says the Church asks us to pause for a moment, take a moment to think about death. It can seem morbid, but in this week's Pro-Life Focus, we explore how the inescapable reality of death should impact our life for the better.
It took me a while to see past the tragedy, I think.
As a sixth-generation funeral director, Caleb Wild grew up surrounded by death.
We'd go over to my grandparents as children, and the viewing room would be right next to our dining room. So we'd have the holiday meal, and there'd be somebody right in the next space, and it was like we were jumping from something fun and family to something sacred.
After witnessing a series of tragic deaths up close, Wild developed a negative view of mortality for a time, but has now begun to see it differently.
I started to see how people were able to embrace life as they embrace their own mortality. And these small little things that I hadn't seen before slowly became louder and louder, to the place where I was in a dark place and transformed into something where now I feel as though I'm in a great spot in the funeral business.
Father Edward Hathaway, a priest and pastor of Virginia's oldest Catholic church and oldest Catholic cemetery, is highly attuned on the matters of life and death.
Francis called death her friend, but we view death as a passage to life. Death is something we should have a good relationship with without being morbid, and awareness that our true home is on the other side of death.
Hathaway says we need to always view death with the eternal perspective in mind.
Well, we should be frightened by death only in the sense that it helps us to be better, that we understand that we want to go to God with our best self. As much as our life with God begins here, that a definitive union and fulfillment and longing that we hope for of our soul with God will only happen after our death, when we're transformed and purified.
Some Catholics practice the long tradition of memento mori, or remember your death, by keeping a skull, an hourglass, or another symbol in a visible spot as a reminder of our temporary time here on earth.
Not something I'm inclined toward personally, because I do want to use every moment I have here well to serve God. But if that helps you to be more mindful of the fleeting nature of even the beauty of the human body, or the beauty of our life here, to see that paling in comparison to what we'll have in heaven, and also to keep us on the right pathway.
As Father Hathaway and I walk along Virginia's oldest Catholic cemetery, where at least 5 Revolutionary soldiers are buried, he reminds us to always remember those who have died in our prayers.
We never do anyone a favor by assuming they're in heaven already. Who's perfect when we die? The canonized saints we know for sure are in heaven. But our beloved dead, we want to keep praying. And if they don't need our prayers, if they already are in heaven, they're not in need of our sacrifices and prayers, then they'll be redistributed, I'm confident.
We must pray for those who have gone before us and pray for our own lives.
We'll die the way we've lived. So trying to live well. We don't know the day or the hour, so we always want to be prepared to meet God without being afraid.
So death no longer has its sting. Let us remember to keep the faithful departed in our prayers, and that frequent confession is never a bad idea. That's it for this edition of EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. Once again, we hope you're having a blessed time with your loved ones this Thanksgiving week. We'd love to hear from you at prolifeweekly@EWTN.com, and I look forward to seeing you here again next week. Life is a gift. Your life is a gift. God bless.